The behavior by one of those branches of government, the executive, behavior by the president, has shaken the nation in a way that is reflected in that big long list of headlines from the Fourth Estate. People are freaking out because of the president's behavior. That leaves two other branches, right? The judiciary and the legislature. In terms of the judiciary, full steam ahead. The criminal and counterintelligence hardcore investigation of the Russian attack and the question of whether or not Americans were complicit in that is proceeding great guns right now. That leaves one other branch of government. That leaves the much beleaguered, unloved legislature of the United States, the U.S. Congress, which is now trying to find itself, trying to find its own role, trying to find its way forward in what is now widely acknowledged to be a national security crisis in this country, surrounding the question of the president's basic loyalties. It's not necessarily going the way you might think in Congress right now. Today in Congress, the Judiciary Committee in the House, led by Republicans, like all the committees, they were holding a hearing on social media filtering when the top Democrat on that committee, Congressman Jerry Nadler, basically pulled the emergency brake and tried to reroute that hearing in a different direction.
Mr. Chairman, last Friday, Special Counsel Robert Mueller indicted 12 Russian nationals for hacking into the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and several state election systems. This indictment is a remarkable piece of forensic work. Mr. Chairman, this latest indictment can surely be seen as the equivalent of the Phoenix memo about 9/11. It is a warning. We must heed it. Yesterday in Helsinki, President Trump said he does not believe it. He sided with Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence community. This is a catastrophe in the making. If we do not take any action, the American people may not trust the outcome of the next election. This is a national emergency, and our silence is unacceptable. Our nation is under attack. Accordingly, under Committee Rule 3B and House Rule 11G2A, I move that the committee now go into executive session for the purposes of discussing the evidence in our possession that speaks directly to the special counsel's indictment and to the president's apparent submission to the Russian government.
The evidence in our possession. Let's go into executive session to discuss the evidence in our... I don't know what evidence the House Judiciary Committee has in its possession that speaks directly to the special counsel's indictment about the Russian government hacking into the Democratic Party to influence the presidential election. I don't know what evidence the Judiciary Committee has in its possession that speaks directly to the president's submission to the Russian government. But that's the top Democrat in the Judiciary Committee trying to halt their existing hearing today, basically declaring an emergency and trying to force that committee to go into executive session to consider that evidence that he says they have and to start dealing with those questions. Now, naturally, the Republicans did not go for it. But, you know, for all of the statements of concern and sadness and worry and disagreement that we got from Republican members of Congress yesterday in response to the president's behavior, moves like this from Congressman Nadler and from some other Democrats, and now even from some Republicans, are actually pointing a new way forward. They're actually pointing Congress toward the opportunity to actually do something if they desire to. I know it's a crazy idea, but conceivably they could. In a national security crisis, we look to the president for leadership. When the national security crisis is the president, we need to look somewhere else for leadership. The other elected leadership we've got in this country, federally, is in Congress. And what's starting to happen now is that Congress is starting to get an idea of some specific things it might be able to do. You saw that from Congressman Nadler there. Today, Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire said that the Foreign Relations Committee, where she's a member, should convene a hearing for them to receive testimony from the American interpreter who was present in the room when President Trump met privately with President Putin, with no other U.S. officials present. Well, technically, that American translator is kind of a U.S. official. She works for the government. So Senator Shaheen now says that she wants to hear testimony. The Foreign Relations Committee should get testimony from that translator, because that is the only way that we as a nation can determine what may have specifically been discussed between Trump and Putin, what may have been agreed to on the United States' behalf in that meeting. That became a particularly urgent concern this afternoon when the Russian government put out a statement in their state media announcing that the Russian military was eager to start implementing the new plans for Syria that were agreed to yesterday by President Trump and President Putin at their summit. What new plans for Syria? There was no public announcement of any new plan for Syria. There was no discussion about some new agreement between the U.S. and Russia on Syria. Nothing that was described by other U.S. officials or described publicly by either president. But now today, according to the Russian government, there was some new plan agreed to on Syria, and the Russian military is ready to get to work on it with our military. Okay, how are we going to find out what that plan is? If not from, I guess, the translator, who was the only other American sitting there while President Trump and President Putin had their little turn on the tire swing together yesterday. In the wake of the national freakout, in the wake of the national security crisis caused by the president's performance before the Russian president yesterday, Democrats also suggested today that one thing Congress could do is simply increase funding to the states so the states can work on their election security for the midterms. Director of National Intelligence on Friday, Dan Coates, gave a speech in which he said the warning lights are blinking red the way they were before 9/11. He said, quote, "Today the digital infrastructure that serves this country is literally under attack. These agents are persistent, they are pervasive, they are meant to undermine America's democracy. The warning signs are there, the system is blinking. It is why I believe we are at a critical point." In the face of those kinds of warnings, even from the president's own appointed national intelligence director, the Trump White House 2 months ago did fire the top cybersecurity official at the National Security Council. As the New York Times reported, when the cybersecurity czar had his job eliminated by the Trump administration in May, quote, "The cybersecurity experts and members of Congress said they were mystified by the move." Well, if mystified members of Congress don't understand why that happened, Congress could ask. If Congress wants to now do something in the face of documented Russian attacks on our election, the intelligence community's hair-on-fire assertions that those attacks are continuing, the president's public inexplicable denial of those attacks, and the president publicly siding with Russia against his own government and his own country on these issues specifically, Congress could ask, right? Congress has the option to hold hearings if they were also mystified. They could hold hearings on why the top cybersecurity official at the White House was fired months before the midterm elections. He was not only fired, his job was eliminated and he was not replaced. And Congress has options. Our elected officials have plenty of practical things they could do right now, today, to pick up the slack on this as a national security matter, to try to protect the country, to try to figure out the extent of what has been done by Russia and their confederates while we are still in the midst of this attack. There's stuff to do. There's plenty of stuff to do. It's not even stuff that's hard to do. Hold on, a quick, very practical